The most common critique of economics is really dumb. So, for context, economics, it's a field. Like many fields, it relies on certain assumptions. Um, just like math has a certain set of certain assumptions, just like philosophy, maybe you start out with some assumptions before you can get anywhere. Economics also starts out with a set of assumptions. For example, it says the principle of scarcity, that there's a limited amount of things in the world. There's the idea that individuals are rational, um, so they're acting in their rational self interest. That's the other thing, individuals are self interested. Um, we also assume that although there's the principle of scarcity, things are scarce, people's wants are not scarce, so people's desires are infinite. Um, I already said, like, people make choices to maximize utility. The aim of firms is to maximize profits. We can also assume ceteris paribus, which means all other things being equal. We do this for thought experiments. We can say, like, uh, for example, like if you raise tariffs, what is the effect of that going to be on prices? Well, ceteris paribus, it would cause this, it would cause prices to rise. What does that mean? Um, well, that means like, okay, assuming that you raise tariffs and then you don't do anything else, then everything else is equal. So that will cause prices to rise. That's what it means, right? So it starts at a bunch of assumptions. And if you go into an Econ 101 class, like the first day or the first week, you're going to have the professor or the teacher, they're going to explain, okay, lesson one, here are the assumptions that go into economics. Number one, people are rational. People are trying to maximize utility. Okay, they're going to explain that to you. And then for the rest of your career learning economics, you're going to assume that's true. Now, what's the dumb argument that people make? Okay, the dumb argument people make about economics is, don't you know that these assumptions are not true? Economics is a broken profession, and economists are idiots. Because, for example, economists, the stupid people they are, the people who don't understand reality and are trying to make this like fake world where people behave differently, they assume that individuals are rational. But my cousin Buster, let me tell you, Buster did something really irrational last week. He drove a truck into a tree, and that was irrational. Okay, they'll come up with a better thing than that, but like, they'll say, why do people play the lottery? If they're perfectly rational, don't they do the math and know that like the lottery is bad, rationally speaking? And then you can get into, okay, well, but it also has the utility that people have fun playing the lottery. So do we say it's like a game and they get utility from that? Do they get like entertainment utility? Or is it like they're addicted to playing the lottery? So you could go at like a million different angles with it. But that's the thing. Like people are not rational. Um, Individuals, they're not self-interested. You say they're self-interested. Well, what about people who give to charity? That's not self-interest. Or what about how people care for their kids? That's not self-interest. So that's wrong. Economists already they have no idea what they're talking about. Okay. Um People's wants are infinite? No. What about monks who go live in the woods and are okay with nothing? That disprove economics that you have monks exist, right? Um and individuals make choices to maximize utility. What is utility? Like, what if someone wants to sell all of his possessions and go live in a monastery or something? Is that utility? Well, technically, if being a monk is like the highest utility thing for you, like burning all your money could be like high utility, but then aren't you like special pleading with that? So, okay, you can say all these things. Um, so I guess there are different kinds of people who make these arguments. There are people who like are trained economists and they're like experts in this field. I'll talk about that later. But oftentimes when people like make edutainment videos about this, it just reads like someone who doesn't really understand how economics works. It's like, for example, let's say you go into physics class and you go into the Physics 101 lecture. And then your physics is saying, okay, class, we're going to start with Newtonian physics. And here's the thought experiment. We're going to say that there's a spherical cow. I know people make jokes about this, haha, but yeah, there's a spherical cow and there's no air resistance and the cow is on a perfect sphere. Or no, the cow is on a slope and it's a perfect slope. What is uh the fall rate? And then let's say that the kid who's like the know-it-all, he goes up and says, excuse me, professor. Um, First of all, cows are not spherical. Maybe you know that. So your whole like thing that doesn't work. Second, um, actually, in the real world, it's not a perfect vacuum. So did you consider air resistance? Did you consider that? Huh? Okay. I think like people would laugh at him because like no, the professor knows the cows are not spheres. Okay. When you say like, don't economists know that people aren't rational? I'm the first person ever to think of that. No, like, economists know that people aren't rational. There's this thing called, like, stochasticity, which, um, in mathematics, it's like nuanced. It can mean a few things, I think, but essentially it means, uh, it's scale dependent. So, how something behaves on a small scale will have an effect that, like, averages out into a large phenomenon on a large scale, right? Um, so let's say, quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics has these special effects, but on the wide scale, we don't even need to worry about that. We can use Newtonian physics because the quantum dynamics, you only need to know about any specific quantum action if you're studying on a very, very small scale. On a wide enough scale, it all averages out. Or even a better example, right? Um, let's say I have this tissue box and it's sitting on my desk. Why does it not fly into the sky? I think this is an example from Taleb. Regardless of if I agree everything else he says, this is a good example. I think it's from Taleb. So he says, "Why does my tissue box not fly into the sky?" Well, because it's stationary. It's not moving. But hold on, it is moving. Actually, every single atom, almost, in this tissue box is moving. We call that temperature. But they're all moving in different directions. One atom moves this way, one atom moves this way, and it all cancels out. And to me, it looks like the tissue box is stationary. Um, so for the tissue box to fly into the sky, it would have to be that all of the particles in the box would not just move in opposite and random directions, they would have to move in the same direction, right? And statistically, the chance of that happening is like on the tippy top curve of the bell curve, where you have like 10 million, 10 billion trillion particles. What is the chance of every single one moving in that direction? It's like statistically unlikely, or there might be some principle that says it's actually impossible. You need like some sort of aggregate energy to move it in that way. So when economists say people are self-interested, it doesn't really even matter if some people are not self-interested, unless they're self-interested enough in the same way, in an aggregate way, to where you can measure that, and it's like an interest group, a group of people who do that, and you can measure that. You can measure like the effect of altruistic giving on the economy. Um, but the idea like that people are vicious, people are cutthroat, people will just try to do anything they can to make money. Let's say that that's your assumption. Well, it is going to be true like on the aggregate because it doesn't even matter if everyone is like that. Because if even only a few people are like that, those people will exploit that niche and they will profit out of that niche to where on the aggregate, like that niche is going to be exploited because there are enough like greedy, selfish people that if there's a greedy, selfish niche, enough people will occupy it that it'll be a thing. So it doesn't even if 1% of people were like that, they would grow and grow in their power and they would take over that. So the idea that people are like selfish and self-interested, you only need a small percentage of people to actually satisfy that to make it true on like the grand level. So that's the first thing. That's assuming that people who make these arguments are ignorant. So there are non-ignorant people who make these same arguments. People like behavioral economics, behavioral economists. So I generally, I like behavioral economists. I read, Kahneman and all these people. Um, and I kind of have mixed feelings about them, right? Because for one thing, it is kind of ironic that some of the best understanding that we have of human behavior, it comes out of economics, which is the field that stereotypically, based on what I said before, a lot of people would associate with being the least accurate in its understanding of human behavior. In fact, that's the field that generates some of the best innovations in our understanding of human behavior because If you start from certain assumptions, then you can study that and study on top of that and build general aggregations and understand the exceptions in more detail. And that's what happens. Behavioral economics. It is economics. It's an outgrowth of economics, and economics is a great framework for coming up with those findings. The only problem I have with behavioral economists is when they make the mistakes that I kind of illustrated earlier, or they assume that other economists are just idiots, or that they're the first person to think of that. That's the only trouble I have with behavioral economists. And some of them kind of do that when they're, at least like when they're pandering to other audiences, they'll make themselves out like, oh, other economists, they're like stupid. We figured it out, right? That's the problem I have with behavioral economists. Another thing that you'll see come under a lot of scrutiny is the so-called efficient market hypothesis. And I feel like this is another midwit trap, the ultimate midwit trap. And I've probably heard the efficient market hypothesis, I've heard it more times being debunked than actually explained. So, I mean, the Wikipedia first sentence, it says, the efficient market hypothesis is the hypothesis in financial economics that states that asset prices reflect all available information. So sometimes people caricature this or like elaborate on it, and they make the jokes like that this means that if an economist he sees a dollar bill on the ground, he will say I shouldn't pick it up because if that was a good deal, then someone would have already taken advantage of that, and so it would have been priced out. So it's like the idea you see a lot in financial markets. If you think you have some great insight about, go long on the stock, well, any information that that's publicly available, it's already priced in. Everything is priced in. So it's not like you can like time the market. Unless you're an expert trader, you're gonna have a really hard time picking individual stocks because everything that is probably already priced in. That's part of sort of the efficient market hypothesis. But the efficient market hypothesis, I would say like there's a strong version and a weak version, right? So the strong version is the version that most people critique. They say this is obviously wrong. I saw a clip once of Jim Simmons. He said, "Oh, there's this thing called the efficient market hypothesis, and it says that essentially everything's already priced in, but it's wrong, actually." And I was just struck with that. Like, okay, yeah, this is probably the worst person in the world to tell you this. Jim Simmons, the most successful investor of all time. Yeah, for him, the efficient market hypothesis is false, but for everyone else, it's true. So that's the strong version of the efficient market hypothesis, is the idea that you can never make money off of anything. And that's obviously wrong, okay? I'll concede that there is a version of the EMH which is obviously wrong. If it were true, then no entrepreneur would ever be able to make money. If it were true, then no hedge fund manager would ever be able to make money. But it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that no hedge fund manager is ever able to make money. You, Jim Simmons, who hires hundreds of exclusively PhDs, like the smartest people in the world by IQ, just sit in a room and like come up with extremely complicated math formulas to like beat out. That's gonna beat out the like average investor in his basement. Sure. And the entrepreneur who works for years and comes up with a brilliant insight about the market and makes money off that, sure, they can make money. And if the efficient market hypothesis says no one can ever beat the market, then it's wrong. But the way I understand the weaker version of the efficient market hypothesis, it's very true. I think that essentially it means that sure, you can beat the market, but in order to beat the market, you need to work for it. I no way better way of saying it than that. Like you need to work for it. You either need to know something that other people don't know, or yeah, I guess that's it. You need to like have some insight that other people don't know, and so unique that like no one has ever capitalized on that insight before, which is very uncommon. It takes extreme like mathematical precision, like essentially Renaissance technologies doing unique things with machine learning before that was even a popular thing. That you can do that, or you can just be really smart in terms of analysis of the market. But most people aren't going to do that. This might seem like another strange analogy, but the efficient market hypothesis sort of reminds me of like Darwinian evolution, where there's a heuristic that like biologists, evolutionary biology, is a heuristic that says when it sees a trait in an organism, then assuming that the trait is like not a spandrel, that it actually incurs some like metabolic cost on the organism to maintain that trait. If it persists for a long enough time, if you like see the organism has like a weird horn or a weird tail or some weird feathers or extra arm or something, you can assume that that trait confers a survival advantage on that organism. Why? Is it because the organism wanted that trait? No, it's because it's the selective pressure of Darwinian evolution. This is how it works, right? Um, you have all these organisms that are in the environment. The environment doesn't let everyone survive and reproduce. But if you survive and reproduce, then you're more fit than the organisms that didn't survive and reproduce. So if you survive and reproduce for a long enough time, you must have traits that are better adapted to that environment. And so this is going to select for certain kinds of traits that if they carry a metabolic cost, they're going to be lost really quick. And so this is not a perfect heuristic. This is not to say that every single trait that an organism has is going to always confer a survival advantage. There can be exceptions. There can be weird things like weird evolutionary dips on the adaptive landscape, or I don't know, vestigial organs or like spandrels or whatever, and you can come up with theories of like why things can not convey a survival advantage. But generally speaking, uh, evolution by natural selection, that's a thing. We understand it pretty well. And if you see an organism has a big horn, okay, well, probably that horn has a use. Either it's, some sort of signaling, it's like sexual selection, natural selection, survival, reproduction. It has a use. And I sort of think of the market like this: the market is a giant evolutionary machine. It every day it down selects, it um, kills like people who not kills physically, although maybe that too, but it kills um, like firms that aren't fit enough to survive and don't have their financials right, are poorly managed. You need to be really on top of it, and this is going to select for a certain kind of efficiency. This is why markets are efficient, is because they kill the weak members. The fact that markets kill the weak, there's a prior selection that you only participate in a market if you think that you're going to be able to survive. But the main way the markets are efficient is that they kill the firms that are not efficient, right? And this produces a sort of effect where everything is priced in, sort of like not the optimum, but approximating the optimum, similar to the efficient market hypothesis. So that's a useful heuristic in many different domains.